So I'm Aoife Monks, and I'm the director of the Queen Mary Centre for Collaboration, and it's been a real pleasure for us to be able to support this event this evening and to celebrate Wasafiri. Wasafiri's had its home at Queen Mary twice now, and while it's made its home here, it also makes it a home for us. We're grateful for the presence of such an extraordinary literary magazine, and also I think it's really important to celebrate the legacy of this magazine, because we all know how hard it is to stay going when you're a small artistic enterprise. And I think a real testament to the commitment and vision and energy of the team as it has evolved over those 40 years is the storage problems they're now facing with the back catalogue, which they have to navigate somehow, and we see that in our offices at Queen Mary. So I wanted to congratulate you all on generating a storage problem. So it definitely testifies to the extraordinary work that Wasafiri have done over the years. I'm going to pass over to the panel, but thank you all so much for this extraordinary work.
Okay, hello and welcome everyone. It's really lovely to see so many of you, especially coming out in this sudden cold snap that we've had, so thank you. And it's good to see so many of you here to listen to our special guests, Dr. Susheila Nasta and Dr. Goyal, who are going to be in conversation this evening. It's an honour to chair them both. And as chair, I also want to maybe slightly indulge myself by welcoming two other guests today, my mother, Blanche, and my daughter, Taslima, who've seen me for the first time doing what I do. So, hello, Mum, and hello, Taslima. Just to add, there is also another exhibition at the Mary Library. So any brave souls that want to go back out into the cold at the end of the evening, the library, so you can view it there. So if you wouldn't want to go, let me know. Otherwise, you can always come back. Again, let us know and we'll make sure that you can gain some access there. So without further ado, let's get going. And of course, I have to do brief bios, and I've had to cut them down considerably because they're both very accomplished people. But I'll start with Dr. Goyal, who is the editor and publishing director of Wasafiri. Her reviews have appeared in The Guardian, Financial Times, The Times Literary Supplement, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Poetry Review, Vogue India, and elsewhere. She was the judge for the 2022 Orwell Prize for Political Fiction and 2023 Republic of Consciousness Prize, and is a judge for the 2025 International Booker Prize. And Dr. Susheila Nasta, MBE, is Emeritus Professor of Modern and Contemporary Literatures, and of course, founding editor of Wasafiri, the magazine of international contemporary writing. And I'll stop it there because we could really go on. So I have a series of questions, but we're really hoping this is going to be a conversation, really. But we'll see how we go, and hopefully you'll find it of interest. So Susheila, I will start with you, of course. Do you remember the exact moment you had the idea? 40 years ago.
Wow. I don't think there was a precise moment. I think it evolved. As many of you will know, there was an organisation that preceded the emergence of Wasafiri, which was called, sounds a bit boring now, but it was called ATCAL, the Association for the Teaching of Caribbean, African and Associated Literatures. Asian came in later. I was the treasurer of that organisation. I do remember the meeting where I proposed it, which was at the Africa Centre, which Alistair Niven, who was one of the people involved with Wasafiri for a long time and became literature director of the Arts Council eventually, was at that point the director of the Africa Centre. And we were having our meeting, very kindly he'd let us have his office, the ATCAL meeting. And ATCAL was folding at that point, running out of money. Its initial mission, which was to put these texts by African, Caribbean, Asian, Black British authors onto the largely school curriculum, had begun to be taken over by local multicultural so-called inspectorates. It had also just literally just run out of money. And I remember sitting in that meeting and saying, I think we need to do something else, and I think we need to go much bigger. I think we should start a magazine. And that was it.
And that was it, simple as that. But clearly everybody agreed.
They agreed. They didn't have any money to fund us. It helped to fund the first issue, but was then the Commonwealth Institute in High Street, Kensington.
And 40 years on, here you are.
I know, it's incredible.
So this is a question for both of you then. Given that we are at 40 years, what do you see as the secret to Wasafiri's success?
I think Wasafiri has always put writers first. I think the sense of community and sanctuary that it has offered for a lot of writers who weren't finding that in the mainstream publishing industry and academia, in the way in which their own work was featured or criticism about their work was featured. I think there's some of that. There's some of this, what I think is like a really sweet spot that Wasafiri holds, which is, straddling the academic space as well as the publishing industry. And I think that's what really, attracted me to kind of, apply for a Chase placement here. That connection with the academic space, should I still want to go back there, or the larger publishing industry? And I can talk a little bit more about this later, but just this sense of feeling really disillusioned by what, the bigger publishers have to offer.
But seeing that Wasafiri is actually doing that, filling that space.
That gap, I think so.
Susheila, what would you say?
Well, I'd say lots of things. I think one thing is that Wasafiri was never an object, it was a process. So it was about, I think it's sort of really following what Sana's saying, it's about writers and a space for writers and a mobility and agility for writers to express whatever they're going to express through their own voices. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that it's always been open to change. It's always been flexible in terms of the different cultural, political, social moments the magazines lived through, and it's obviously a lot. I should also say, going back to that 1984 moment, that it only occurred to me later because when I started it, I was in my 30s, wasn't really thinking about it, had no idea about how to be an editor, I just had this vision. But now that I look back, kind of looking back at it through a cultural, political kind of lens, there were a lot of other movements that were happening at that moment in terms of the activism that Wasafiri was sort of trying to get across in terms of the school curriculum initially to its readers. So, lots of presses were starting, Korea Press, Sheba Press. 1984 was, Hanif Qureshi's on at the moment. We went to see it on Saturday. The Buddha of Suburbia, My Beautiful Laundrette came out. Southall Black Sisters had started a few years before. Race Today had started. So even though all these things were happening, and and I wasn't particularly kind of conscious of each one, it was a moment, and many of those things came together at something called the International Black Book Fair, which was launched in, I think it was 1982, but I'm right. So all these movements, or kind of communities, if you like, were interrelating. And I've got here, I brought it along because I was digging through my papers. Some of you may never have seen this, but it was a magazine called Artrage. Well, Deirdre's nodding. But, I just thought it was interesting because the 40th birthday issue of Wasafiri, which features an image by Chilla Kumari Burman, in this issue, which was from, well, I can't remember, I think it's around 1986 actually, but anyway, you have an interview with Chilla Kumari Burman, you have Errol Lloyd on the board, you have Margaret Busby on the board, you have Archie Markham, the major poet from Montserrat, editing it. So all these things were going on, and then there was a whole review of something called a black visual arts exhibition, which was featuring, again, artists that I just mentioned, and Labina Hamid and many others. So I suppose I'm trying to get across the idea that it was a sort of moment
Bit of a critical mass.
in 1984, and it was sort of, I know we're in the sort of post-Trump election at the moment, but you know, we were all reacting to Thatcher at that point. So in a funny way, that kind of feeling of a need for resistance bring us hope in the current times. But anyway, there we are. But you know, so that I thought was kind of interesting. Anyway, I just dug it out. I've got several of these, but Fred Daguerre was on the board as well. So the poet.
Do you mind if I jump in?
No, please,
Can I
please.
ask really quickly whether, you know, you said you weren't quite sure that there were all these other organizations and other things that are happening. Something about like how important it is to be in conversation with other small movements or arts organizations, because I feel like and we'll come to this, I think, but now thinking about the future, we're just, you know, we're constantly thinking about partnerships and collaborations and talking to the people around us and listening to them, because a lot of us are in the same boat. We're all worried about the next funding cycle or, you know, staff retention and those very sort of basic things. And I wonder if you could say something about that, how that felt to...
At the time.
Yeah, at the time, yeah.
Well, I suppose one of the things I should have said, I mean, just going back to what we were talking about 1984 was, and which went on for 20 years, was that independent organisation.
Yes.
It did go to Routledge, and it has gone into the Arts Council, but before that it was just its own thing. It was independent and struggling. So in terms of collaborations, they were really, really important. I mean, Wasafiri, and you know, and I know we were just talking about space in the office, but basically we had collaborations, and some of this is in the, talking of archives, in my study at home. We had collaborations with Third Text and Rashid Areen, who was at that point the editor of Third Text, Richard Dyer, who's now the editor of Third Text, which is kind of started in 1984, a sister magazine to Wasafiri in a way, but visual arts. He became managing editor of Wasafiri at one point, so that was another overlap. We had partnerships with all sorts of academic journals all over the world. We also had partnerships with all sorts of literary magazines. And so when I was going through my archive this afternoon, you opened something. I opened an issue, and a Penguin ad, you know, flyer for the Penguin Anthology of Caribbean Verse falls out, or something else falls out. So these things were absolutely critical. And I think it's more difficult now because, in a funny way, in a way it's a casualty of its own success, that becoming an NPO, or National Portfolio Organisation of the Arts Council, people begin to get in competition with each other. So that sharing is often more complicated.
But can we talk a little bit more about the funding environment? Because obviously it's very precarious, isn't it? Even though, as you say, there is an NPO of the Arts Council, it just feels like none of this is guaranteed forever, and that, you know, the funding is always being reduced, and it's a smaller and smaller cut that people are asking to take from. You know, what are your thoughts about that?
Tough questions. It's hard not to think about this on a daily basis. You know, it feels like an existential crisis. It is. Yeah, I don't know.
Stumped you.
No, it's something we think about a lot. It's something I think we've always had to think about. I feel like there's this simultaneous proliferation of small presses in the UK and the work they're doing, or, you know, new online magazines coming up, and at the same time you hear about small presses closing down and magazines. So the White Review, for example, a lot of magazines folding primarily due to funding issues. It's really difficult to know where you stand sometimes. I think as part of that larger landscape and what's going on. You think about money all the time, is what I'm going to say.
But I think Wasafiri has proven itself to be able to navigate quite a difficult funding environment. I mean, you're still here.
I mean,
when many others have folded.
I think when we started, I think going back to what we were saying in the last sort of bit of the discussion, it's, the main funding has been people. People, the family of Wasafiri, lots of people working for nothing. I mean, we're in an era now which is correct, where everything's been professionalized. So yes, people have to get paid. They have salaries. None of us had salaries. I never got paid for being the editor of Wasafiri, ever.
I remember you saying.
It came out of my university research. It was my 1 day a week research leave.
Which is ridiculous.
And, so once we made that jump professionally and it came out of becoming an MPO, then you're dealing with a different situation. You have several salaries to pay for, and you are in a different, economic environment. And we have been very lucky because Wasafiri straddles so many different things. Because we were both a creative magazine and also a hybrid in terms of academia, and in part straddling the visual arts world, we managed to get funding from 3 sources. I mean, first of all, we had, nothing. Pots from the Arts Council, ethnic minority pots, largely. Then we became a mainstream client of the Arts Council. Then we eventually moved into MPO status. That was in 2013. That's a long way down the history. And very kindly, Queen Mary, as we know, and the University of Kent before that, when they took me on, I remember my interview with Lisa Jardine at Queen Mary, and they offered me the job. And I said, well, if you have me, you're going to have Wasafiri, and I want 2 offices.
You went in negotiating.
I did. I did. And then about a year later, I said, actually, I need an assistant. And then we got the first sort of assistant I had, who was partly a research fellow doing a PhD with me, and partly the kind of managing editor of Wasafiri, Tony Ilona. And then Richard Dyer, who was at Third Text, took over. So Queen Mary was helping to fund this. And then later the Open University did it for a long time. And then I came back. So it's kind of, the universities, even though we're living in a world where the humanities is being hammered, have been absolutely crucial in maintaining Wasafiri and believing in it.
Yes.
And it would not exist without the Arts Council funding, the university funding, and actually in the end, at the 20th birthday year, Routledge said, why are you stuffing envelopes? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why don't we just do it? But we were able to negotiate with them, so they didn't change it into a A5 academic journal.
Gosh, I can't imagine what Wasafiri would look like now if he hadn't done that negotiation as well. But I just want to maybe go back a bit as we're talking about the Arts Council, where the interconnectedness with lots of very sort of different and influential people. One of the boards in the exhibition is a letter from Alistair Niven, who you mentioned right at the beginning. He had a great deal of belief in Wasafiri. So would you say that he was, you're instrumental at the Arts Council in helping to kind of continue that, get that funding continued year after year?
I think there were communities of people, actually. There were all sorts. Alistair was a big supporter. He'd been involved with an organisation called AtClals, which was a sort of European version of what AtCal was, but it was really mainly aimed at universities. He taught at the University of Stirling. He was interested particularly in what was then called Commonwealth literature. Then he became literature director of the Arts Council, literature director of the British Council. So his influence there was good, but it wasn't a kind of pat patronage of Wasafiri, because Wasafiri went through rigorous scrutiny by, you know, the magazine committees that were set off at the time against the London Magazine and anything else that happened to be on the table for funding. So it helped. I mean, there was one person who was very instrumental at the Arts Council who helped us hugely in the 90s when we started to get mainstream funding, and that was a woman called Clarissa Luard, who was actually Salman Rushdie's first wife. And she was, at that point, what we now call the relationship manager, but anyway, she was the literature officer at the Arts Council. And she said to me, who does this magazine belong to? You've got to make it the intellectual property of something or someone. We had the old ATCAL charity constitution. I took it to the Charity Commission. They made it a charity because of the education side of it. And then we made it a company. We set up directors. We got formal boards. She said, get a formal board of well-known writers to support it. And that's what we did. And that was really good advice.
Yes. Gosh, it's quite stunning history, really. Okay, well, let's move on a little bit. Sana, you did mention it earlier, so I want to come back to it, that you joined Wasafiri as a chase intern. Firstly, what's a chase intern? And then you became digital editor halfway through that placement, and then you became deputy editor and are now its editor and publishing director. So what drew you to Wasafiri? And I think, again, you've kind of touched upon that, but what keeps you here?
I just want to add that the time when I wasn't at Wasafiri in the last 5 years, briefly, I was an associate editor, and I like to say that I think done all the jobs at Wasafiri now except Elizabeth's job, and if she's here, I don't want your job. It's very hard. So the Chase Consortium, this is for PhD. They advertised, they do multiple placements at kind of literary arts organizations, and I saw an ad for this, and when I just started my PhD at SOAS then, and I remember Susheila and Roxana, who was then the deputy editor, they interviewed me for this role. This was, say, 9 months before our 35th anniversary celebrations at the British Library. It was a very busy time to be at the magazine. I think on my second day, I was transcribing an 8,000-word interview, helping to edit it, which was great. It was fantastic. You're really thrown into it. You know, you're not going to just get coffee. You're actually doing the work. And then I think by the third week, I was trying to convince Roxana then the first ever African Literature Festival in Berlin with our then writer-in-residence, Nick McCoha. It was an exciting time to have joined Wasafiri. I think, like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to have that connection. I was still doing my PhD then, and I wanted to have some sort of connection to the academic world, as well as just really find out a little bit more about the publishing industry and how to put out this magazine in the world. And the more I worked at Wasafiri, the more time I spent here, I realized that I didn't really want to be applying for a job at Penguin or HarperCollins or any of the big publishers, and there was important, meaningful, humbling, rewarding work to be done from the so-called periphery of the mainstream industry in pushing for change in the way in which, you know, the politics and ethics of the work that we were putting out. And I think that's what's always kept me here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope I answered.
No, you have. I mean, we could probably talk a little bit more about that, because again, Wasafiri's role has always sort of played a role in championing and platforming new and critical and creative voices across the globe. It's always done that, and it continues to do it. But how does it do that?
I suppose it's done it in lots of different ways through the years, right? Publishing those writers, but there's also a huge mentoring aspect to the work that we have done, or through the prize that also celebrates its 15th anniversary this year.
The New Writing
The
Prize.
New Writing Prize for Fiction, Life Writing and Poetry. It's a global prize for unpublished writers. and it's really just a boost of kind of confidence. And I think, you know, what literary magazines have to offer often to writers who are just starting out is that sense of kind of, you know, that open, inclusive sense of kind of, you know, the acceptance of the work and whatever that work looks like and wherever it's coming from. I think Wasafiri has always done that in lots of different ways.
Yes, yes. And Susheila, what would you say? I mean, what was your impetus to start the New Writing Prize?
Well, we'd just become an MPO. So we had to become an arts organisation rather than a literary magazine. And it was our 25th birthday, I think. It was 2009. And I think we'd run if I'm right in remembering this, we'd run a sort of special schools thing, so that we worked with sixth forms in London, various sixth forms, to create a kind of, we got them to edit an issue of Wasafiri from their 4 different schools. And the Writing Prize was another thing that we did. So the idea was to really just continue the work, but to seek out new and young writers, because if you go through all the sort of issues of Wasafiri and you go right back, you know, you'll find a sort of chorus of lots and lots of voices from around the world. I mean, it started off with obviously African, Caribbean, South Asian, Black British as a focus, but really it's much, much, much broader than that. It's international. It's moved into international contemporary writing, and I think one of the things that I was keen on anyway as the editor was really juxtaposing quite well-known and established writers. I wanted their support in lifting this magazine out of being a so-called marginal ethnic minority enterprise and making people really see that this actually was literature, not the other story, but the whole story. And so that was my main battle all the way through. And so in terms of seeking out writers all over the world, it was to really have them juxtaposed and have these in an open space, which wasn't happening in the mainstream, and to finally start to change people's ways of thinking and seeing the world. And it goes back to, you know, the George Lamming thing in the 1960s when he wrote Pleasures of Exile, when he says, you know, it's ways of seeing that are going to change the way people think. And that's the kind of educational directive. It's also what we were trying to do with the magazine. How do you change people's ways of seeing? That's how we curated things.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the curation. I was going to leave this question to the end, actually, because I saw it as a bit of a fun piece. But I was going to say, what was your easiest curatorial decision, and what was your hardest across the years? Or is there such a thing as an easy or a hard decision when you're curating a magazine?
I think I saw it. I don't think I saw it in terms of curating issues. There were difficult issues, you know, with guest editors who didn't deliver the goods, or issues that you thought were, you know, copy that came in late or wasn't. There were always issues, editorial issues. But I think I saw it, the exciting bits or the difficult bits, in terms of moments when we were publishing things. So in a way, the first issue was a moment, you know, with the Earl Lovelace editorial, when he's talking about ways of seeing and that we speak to each other from our cultural position wherever we are. So that was, and also just trying to put ourselves out there. But then there were other moments, you know, like, you know, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, or before, you know, apartheid so-called ended in South Africa, and so on. I mean, there were moments when it was important to say something. And I think that tradition, if it's, one could call it that, or continuum of activism, I guess, has continued with Wasafiri. So, you know, even after the Black Lives Matter movement, which, you know, had huge success in a way for a while in changing how the mainstream maybe was approaching certain kinds of writing. Wasafiri didn't just get stuck in that particular group, because we'd already been doing this for years, you know. So
I was going to say, actually, there are moments that the magazine does seem quite prescient, that you're already a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of, you know, talking to those moments.
yeah, we were ahead of the curve. I mean, you know, Roger Robinson, you know, I can reel them off. Evaristo, Abdul Razak Gurner, published all these people before they became so-called famous. But the point is, it's not prescient, it's just the optic through which you see it.
Right.
If you're not looking for it and you're not seeing it, then it seems very prescient. It's like that whole exhibition at Somerset House, you know, the Get Up, Stand Up one, when everyone said, oh, wow, you know, and similarly with other artists that are being shown. But the point is, these things have always been there, they just haven't been seen to be there. And that's what Wasafiri is doing.
Sana, your favourite curation? I mean, you've had some amazing covers as well.
Covers have been fantastic.
Any that stand out to you particularly?
I think what Susheila was saying about perspective is really interesting, because there are a lot of things that are trending, and we see these kind of phases in the publishing industry, especially like you mentioned, and then all of the reading lists that came out after that, or the commissioning choices that were made. But it's important to think about the kind of like beyond there, like where do we go from there? Where do we go beyond that moment? And like longevity, right? Like, so I think for me, when I'm curating an issue or an event, it's just trying to think about how Wasafiri can do what it's always done in, you know, what can seem prescient or can seem, and have that Wasafiri spin on these conversations, right? Like, so we don't want to just jump onto the bandwagon, or we don't necessarily, we want to join the conversation, we want to be part of the conversation, we want to start the conversation, but we also want to do it in a way that we've always had these conversations.
Yes.
And I think that's really important. And in terms of, you know, specifically answering your question, I would say that for the state of the industry issue, which was our spring issue this year, the easiest curatorial decision I made was commissioning the poet and translator Elin Wang, who some of you may know. A lot of their work in translation had been stolen by the British Museum, and they hadn't really received the credit for their work, and they sued the British Museum, and they won, and it was fantastic. And they were fighting these battles kind of in real time on Twitter at the time, and you know, I had a conversation with them about Wasafiri being a home for some of those translations. And I really wanted to kind of offer any kind of sort of support to their work at that time, and we ran a few poems by Elin Wang in the issue, but it was also the hardest curatorial decision, well, not necessarily curatorial, but it was a hard decision because they had recently had a lot of their work stolen and were really protective of it. And, you know, I was sending them an agreement by Routledge that's, you know, quite complicated, usually designed for, you know, creative writers are not happy with it. They're never happy with it.
Right.
And that kind of like push and pull there, and realizing, you know, having to convince them that we would take care of their work in that way. And when that piece was finally published, that was really meaningful.
Yes.
So I think I wanted to bring that up to highlight some of the other issues beyond, you know, that get attached to the curation process, right? Or it's not just a simple commission. Sometimes it's never a simple commission, with guest edited issues as well. At the moment, we have a guest editor who has family in Beirut, and they, you know, we're struggling to kind of, you know, work on that issue. When we published the abolitions issue earlier in the summer, we had a lot of writers based in Palestine, and I know Elizabeth struggled to pay one of the writers from that issue because none of the banks want to pay anyone in Palestine. And it's beyond the curation, which can feel really rewarding and exciting, and it feels like the kind of like public-facing side of things, right? Like what gets published, but then it's all of this other. Sometimes, makes it. I enjoy that bit as well because I feel that's part of the full story, like you were saying, Susheila.
I think it's interesting you used the word curation because, which is a good word because actually people sometimes forget, and Routledge often forgets. But Wasafiri, each issue is an entity unto it. And I remember when I was doing it, when you say which one was problematic, I mean, there were moments that were problematic. But I could never believe it each time one of them came out, actually, But that one was done, and then you go into the next one, and I'm sure you feel that now. You kind of move straight into whatever's coming next. But, I mean, there were moments. There were moments when, we have a blind, I'm sure you still do, a blind peer reviewing process. We didn't know who was sending in copy. There was a moment where we had a piece by Kamal Brathwaite, which we didn't like. I didn't like, anyway. And I had, we said no, but at that point it was blind. And then I got a sort of pretty upset letter saying, Susheila. But, so there were moments. Yeah. And I suppose one of the moments, actually, talking about Kamal Brathwaite, was there was and I can't remember which issue was in, but some of you will remember this, there was a debate between a critic called Peter Hume, who was a sort of so-called white male academic working at the University of Essex, who wrote a piece called The Place of White Sargasso Sea, which is a very famous novel. And Kamal Brathwaite wrote a retort and deliberately didn't write it in a sort of linear form. Deliberately wrote it in a very, very complicated typeface, which interrupted all the kind of conventions of Western sort of straightforward, rational, analytic thought. So we had to find a way of printing this thing. But secondly, it was kind of, and then that went on, and that was quite heated.
I think
it was quite tricky. It went through several issues. And then it came up again with Kai Miller and Monique Roffey later.
Yes. And actually, a small plug, I think I have written about that debate between Kamal Brathwaite and Peter Hume in my blog, which is on the Wasafiri website. So, actually, this sort of brings us nicely to the reason we're here, which is the archive. Because you were saying, Sana, people see the glossy pages, they see the glossy cover, but they don't know the work that's done to get there. And, one of the immense privileges I've had as the Wasafiri PhD candidate is to get behind that curtain and to see that. And I've hopefully, in the exhibition that you've seen today, tried to lift a little bit of that veil so that you can see behind that curtain. But I just wanted to ask Susheila, a little similar to the question at the beginning, why did you start the archive? Do you remember the moment you thought, I'm going to keep all this stuff?
No, I think I in the office, it was a joint thing. I think we'd got to about the 20th birthday, and we had I went through a phase with a team that was very stable for about 10 years, and we had plenty of office space. In fact, we had about plus the books that didn't get reviewed all over the Camden OU building. Many of them are now in the Queen Mary Library because Emily Mercer managed to, at one point, when we had to move we were in Goldsmiths for about 6 months. We had to move out of Camden when the OU ran out of money, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, what's going to happen now? And they rented an office in Goldsmiths anyway. There were 5 of us in this one academic's office. And at that point, I was negotiating secretly with Queen Mary, and we had to get rid of all these books. And it was when we got rid of the archive to the BL as well, because we'd started to amass it, and then that's what happened. But the reason I did it was because I began to realise we were moving into a digital age. I began to realise that all these papers were going to get lost, and that so many histories had been lost before. So we were trying to kind of keep it all together, and still, there's a lot missing actually from those early years when we weren't really thinking about it. And now it's even more difficult because it's all digital, and the kinds of email correspondences, unless you print them out, they're quite hard to track, or at least I find them hard to track in a digital medium. Well, so that's why we started it, and also there's so many of these cultural histories that have got lost actually in Britain anyway.
Well, thankfully, quite a good deal of information at the archive in the British Library, over 219 boxes. And I haven't finished them. And over 1,000 books and journals as well. So, not to say the least of all the...
About 4,000 here in the library, they did take it.
Yes. Yeah. So you were talking, Susheila, about the sort of digital age, and this is where I wanted to bring Sana in, because obviously you're running the office at Wasafiri now, and a lot of the stuff that you work on is digital. It's all email. It's all behind a digital wall. How do you see yourself sort of continuing or caring for the archive in a digital way?
I think we have to have a slightly different approach to it now, just because of the mediums we work with. So the board meeting minutes are replaced by conversations on Slack, or because of the transient nature of sort of working with social media, etc. We have to have a slightly different approach to it. I think in terms of cataloging it. I think also archives are deliberate acts of kind of putting a story together. They're often not the full story, and I think thinking about the future, it's been really interesting to kind of go back into the Wasafiri archives and sort of identify the silences or the gaps, or as you mentioned, Susheila, Wasafiri is a process, and that kind of it's a very, very active thing. And I think it's been really interesting to think about all of the work that has happened that is catalogued in this particular story that we know, but also those other organizations that will work alongside Wasafiri and how intertwined those histories are, and the writers that came out of Wasafiri and the archives that they have built, and how that kind of comes back to tell Wasafiri's story. I think it's important to think about that. I think I don't think about the archive in the same way, or I struggle to think about, archiving something as this is what I have archived
as a physical object.
As a physical object, and I think that's why it's, I appreciate archives are really sort of alive, important spaces, but I don't even realize when I'm archiving something, and I think that worries me a little bit, that we're losing a lot of that, those drafts, or those draft graphics before we got to the final graphic that would make it onto social media. We lose some of that now, because we're not deliberately archiving it in the same way.
Yes.
We don't then engage with that archive as much either, because it's online and it's in these kind of varied spaces. Yeah, that I find it difficult to kind of see what to do with that.
Yes,
in the future.
yes. So definitely some thinking
Yeah.
to do in terms of an archive strategy, making sure that these things are kept and retained. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any work for PhDers like me. So that was really my last question, my last thought. Unless you both have anything else that you'd like to add, I'm probably going to ask. We've probably got time for about two questions. But,
I think I just want to say, as far as the digital thing is, I think it is actually quite disturbing what might be happening, because I'm not just saying that with Wasafiri, but everybody knows it's happening with writers' archives too. But if you don't see the stages of an editorial, you know, I think what's in the archive of the BL and also what's in the archive of, you know, an editor that I was researching called Tambi Mutu, who launched Poetry London in the late 30s. You know, in those archives, you see correspondences with writers, you see process of commissioning something, editing it, bringing it to fruition, which is it is all a process. And what's scary, I think, is that if you just go on the digital archive, actually what you see is the end product, as you were saying, cover or whatever. That's actually not that interesting. I mean, it is interesting, but we can see the covers. What's interesting is the dialogues that go on underneath that. So that, I don't know, I think that's kind of something one needs to think about, and keeping, you know, the texture of, you know, even this kind of event, and what went into making the event, and what went into the thinking behind making that room, which we've all enjoyed looking at. All those things start to sort of disappear. It's a very delicate thing, I think.
Well, I mean, I feel like we could just keep talking. There's so much to say, but unfortunately, we have to bring it to a close there. So my thanks to Sana and Susheila for being in conversation. It's been really fun talking and enlightening, I hope, and interesting talking to you both. Thank you.